A car with Ukrainian license plates was filmed in Moscow. The footage immediately spread across social networks, but at the same time it became the reason for a wave of jokes. Attention was drawn to a car with Ukrainian, namely Poltava, license plates, which was driving around the Russian capital. The corresponding video can be seen on the Telegram channel Trua Kremenchuk. The authors of the publication recalled Spiderweb 2.0, which was prepared for a year and a half, and during which a significant part of the Russian strategic air fleet was destroyed. Then the operation was delayed because at the decisive moment the Russian drivers all went on a drinking binge, and another threat of failure appeared when one of the participants exposed drones under the roofs of houses, but this problem was also quickly extinguished. The comments were divided. Some wrote that this car has been driving around Moscow since 2021. Others suggested that the car could have been stolen. And some believe that there are plenty of such cars in the city because there are normal people and laws, unlike in Ukraine. Recall a series of blasts at airbases deep inside Russia on June 1st, 2025, came as a rude awakening to Moscow's military strategists. The Ukrainian strike at the heart, Russia's strategic bombing capability, could also upend the traditional rules of war. It provides smaller military, a blueprint for countering a larger nation's ability to launch airstrikes from deep behind the front lines. Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb involved 117 remote-controlled drones that were smuggled into Russia over an 18-month period and launched toward parked aircraft by operators miles away. The raid destroyed or degraded more than 40 Tu-95, Tu-160 and Tu-M3 strategic bombers, as well as an A-50 airborne early warning jet, according to officials in Kiev. That would represent roughly one-third of Russia's long-range strike fleet and about $7 billion in hardware. Even if satellite imagery ultimately pares back those numbers, the scale of the damage is hard to miss. In Operation Spiderweb, Ukraine has sought to repeat that strategy while also leveraging surprise to achieve psychological shock and dislocation. But the Ukraine operation taps into a uniquely 21st century aspect of warfare. The religious procession that took place in Moscow on September the 7th from the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour to the Novodevichy convent unexpectedly turned into a serious challenge for Russian security forces and sowed panic in the Kremlin. Although the event was initially presented as religious and purely apolitical, the scale of the procession and the composition of its participants caused alarm among Putin's authorities and the special services, writes VCHK-OGPU. According to official data, about 40,000 people took part in the procession. However, independent sources claim that the number of participants could have reached 120,000. In addition to parishioners and representatives of the Russian Orthodox Church, organized groups of nationalist movements were seen in the column. Football fans, so-called veterans of the military actions in Ukraine, and representatives of radical associations. Their mass participation gave the event an overtly political tint and frightened the authorities. For the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the FSB, such a development of events was a complete surprise. Surveillance units were urgently raised, and officers were sent to the streets of the capital to assess the situation. The most interesting thing, according to the information from the reports, is that a significant part of those gathered expressed dissatisfaction with the authorities and the monopoly of ethnic diasporas in the economic sphere. The police and National Guard cordon looked confused and actually dissolved into the multi-thousand column. The very next day, the heads of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the FSB received tough questions from the presidential administration. The data on the scale of the march and the mood of its participants contrasted with the previous optimistic reports of the special services about the people's support for the government. In fact, this event suddenly showed that a new force is capable of gathering in Moscow, representing a mixture of nationalist movements, veterans of the so-called SVO, and PMC fighters. And this force, unlike the liberal opposition, looks more organized and potentially dangerous for the regime. According to sources, the Kremlin's reaction to Sunday's march was painful. There was panic. Putin's leadership is considering personnel changes in the structures responsible for domestic policy and security in order to prevent further precedents of this kind. On September the 8th, 2025, the first Deputy Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation and Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, turned 70, which is formally the age limit for senior officers of the Russian army and a reason for resignation. Russian media asks who could become his successor and what could this change in the current strategy used in the SVO zone. Before the start of the operation in Ukraine, the figure of Chief of the General Staff, Gerasimov, known in narrow circles as Shoigu's man, did not attract such increased attention. He found himself in his post back in 2012 and has held it longer than any of his predecessors in the post-Soviet era. Valery Gerasimov found himself in the spotlight after the start of the SVO, which clearly did not go according to the original plan, whatever it was. But after the withdrawal of Russian troops from the north and northeast of Ukraine, and then from the right bank of the Dnieper, the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, along with his boss Shoigu, found themselves the objects of harsh criticism from the patriotic public of Russia. The former Minister of Defense of the DPR, Igor Girkin-Strelkov, and the top manager of the Wagner PMC, Yevgeny Prigozhin, were the ones who made the most of this simple public appearance. The former ended up behind bars on an extremism case where he remains to this day, and the latter died, along with the commander-in-chief of his private army, Dmitry Utkin, in a plane crash exactly 2 months after his so-called March of Justice, which took place on June the 23rd to the 24th, 2023. But the army tandem Shoigu-Gerasimov did not last much longer. Sergei Shoigu resigned from his post on May the 12th, 2024, and Andrei Belousov took his place. After that, major purges began in the Ministry of Defense, as a result of which a number of high-ranking officers of the Russian army ended up behind bars on charges of bribery, corruption, and fraud. The name of Deputy Minister Timur Ivanov has already become somewhat of a household word. The following assumptions are being made about the future of Chief of the General Staff, Gerasimov himself. Having received the Order of Courage for his 70th birthday, he may retire from military service with honor. It is possible that he may even take up another high-ranking position like his former boss, Sergei Shoigu, who was promoted to become the head of the Security Council of the Russian Federation. 49-year-old Colonel General Andrei Mordvichev is named as a possible successor to Gerasimov as Chief of the General Staff. The former commander of the Central Military District and the Center Group of Forces in the Northeastern Military District, which became famous for liberating the long-suffering Avdiivka, was promoted to Commander-in-Chief of the Ground Forces in May 2025. According to some reports, Mordvichev has been the first Deputy Chief of the General Staff for several days now, and it is with this event that the large-scale transfer of Russian troops to the DPR from other directions is associated. We will discuss in more detail below how the nature of military operations in Donbass may change under his direct leadership.